Rich man falls for a beggar. What his family does when they find out will shock you. The rain poured relentlessly, soaking the bustling streets of the city as pedestrians hurried for shelter. Amid the chaos, Alexander sat in the back seat of his luxury car, staring out at the world he had long taken for granted. The glass windows blurred the scene outside, but one figure stood out, a young woman crouched on the sidewalk, shielding herself and a stray dog under a torn umbrella. Alexander frowned, his curiosity piqued. She wasn't begging for money like others he'd seen in similar situations. Instead, she was feeding the dog with what little she had, a small piece of bread from a plastic bag. The act was so selfless, so genuine, that it caught him off guard. "Sir, should I drive on?" his chauffeur asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. Alexander hesitated for a moment before shaking his head. "No, wait here." Grabbing an umbrella from the seat beside him, he stepped out of the car, his polished shoes splashing into a puddle. As he approached the woman, she looked up startled, her wide eyes meeting his. For a moment, he forgot how to speak. There was something about her unguarded expression, the quiet strength in her gaze, that rendered him speechless. "Do you need help?" he finally asked, his voice softer than he intended. The woman shook her head, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied, her tone polite but firm. Alexander glanced at the dog, now wagging its tail, oblivious to the cold. "That's kind of you," he said, nodding toward the animal. "Most people wouldn't bother." She gave a small smile, though her eyes were wary. Kindness costs nothing. The simplicity of her response hit him harder than he expected. For a man who had spent his life surrounded by wealth and privilege, her words carried a weight he couldn't ignore. The encounter lingered in Alexander's mind long after he returned to the warmth of his home. His family's estate was a stark contrast to the streets he had just left behind, opulent, sprawling, and devoid of warmth. That evening, as he joined his parents and siblings for dinner, he found himself unusually quiet. His father, a towering figure with a commanding presence, noticed immediately. "You're distracted, Alexander. Something on your mind." "Nothing important," Alexander lied, pushing the food around on his plate. "Just a long day." But it wasn't nothing. He couldn't stop thinking about the woman on the street, about her quiet resilience, and the way she had spoken with such dignity despite her circumstances. It unsettled him, this sudden awareness of a world beyond his own. Days turned into weeks, and Alexander found himself drawn back to the spot where he had first seen her. Each time he noticed something new, a fleeting smile as she interacted with strangers, the careful way she shared what little she had with others in need. Her name, he learned, was Lila, and she had been living on the streets for nearly a year after losing her job and home. Their conversations were brief at first, but as Alexander returned again and again, Lila began to open up. She told him about her dreams of becoming a teacher, her love for books, and the struggles she faced each day. In turn, Alexander shared glimpses of his life, a world she could hardly imagine, filled with luxury and expectations. "What brings you here?" Lila asked one evening as they sat on a park bench, the city lights twinkling around them. Alexander hesitated, unsure of how to explain the pull he felt toward her. "You remind me of something I lost," he said finally. "Something real." Lila looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Real isn't always easy." "No," he agreed, a small smile playing on his lips. "But it's worth it." Their bond deepened over time, but it didn't go unnoticed. Alexander's family, always vigilant about appearances, began to question his frequent absences and uncharacteristic behavior. One evening, as he returned home late, his mother confronted him in the grand foyer. "Alexander, we need to talk," she said, her voice clipped. "Your father and I are concerned about the company you've been keeping." "What do you mean?" he asked, though he already knew. "You've been seen with someone," she continued, her distaste evident. "A woman who doesn't belong in our circles." Alexander felt a surge of anger rise within him. "Her name is Lila," he said firmly, "and she's more genuine than anyone in this house." His mother's eyes widened in shock. "Do you have any idea what this could do to our reputation?" "People are talking, Alexander. This infatuation of yours needs to end." "It's not an infatuation," he shot back, "and I won't end it." The confrontation with his mother left Alexander feeling a mix of anger and defiance. He retreated to his room, pacing back and forth as his mind raced. He had spent his entire life following his family's expectations, playing the part of the dutiful son, but for the first time, he felt an unshakable need to push back. Lila had shown him a world beyond his own, one filled with hardship, yes, but also authenticity and kindness. She had taught him to question the shallow values he had grown up with, and he couldn't turn his back on her now. The next day, Alexander returned to the park where Lila often spent her evenings. She was there, sitting on a bench with a book in her hands, her expression calm despite the chaos of the city around her. When she saw him, she smiled, and for a moment, all his worries faded. "Back again," she teased, closing her book. "Don't you have a mansion to be lounging in?" Alexander chuckled, taking a seat beside her. "I'd rather be here." Lila's smile softened. "You don't have to keep coming, you know. I'm fine on my own." "I know," he said, "but I want to." She studied him for a moment, as if searching for the truth in his words. "What's going on, Alexander? You seem distracted." He hesitated and sighed. "My family found out about us." Lila's expression didn't change, but he could see the tension in her posture. "And they want me to stop seeing you," he admitted. "They think you're a threat to their precious reputation." Lila looked away, her voice quiet. "Maybe they're right." "What?" Alexander turned to her, his eyes wide. "How can you say that?" "Because I've seen it happen before," she said, her tone resigned. "People like me, we don't belong in your world. And your family will do whatever it takes to protect theirs." Alexander reached for her hand, his grip firm. "I don't care about their world, Lila. I care about you." She shook her head, pulling her hand away. "But it's not just about you, Alexander. It's about the life you've built, the people you're tied to. I don't want to be the reason you lose everything." The days that followed were difficult. Lila distanced herself from Alexander, refusing to answer his calls or meet him at the park. He tried to respect her wishes, but the ache in his chest only grew stronger. He couldn't let her go. Not like this. Meanwhile, his family's disapproval escalated. His father, a stern and calculating man, called him into his study for a private meeting. The room was cold, lined with bookshelves and portraits of their ancestors, a reminder of the legacy Alexander was expected to uphold. "Alexander," his father began, his voice measured, "I understand that you've developed an attachment to this woman, but it's time to put an end to it." "No," Alexander said, his tone unwavering. "I won't." His father's expression darkened. "You're being naive. Do you have any idea what this could do to our family? To our business?" "I don't care about the business," Alexander shot back. "I care about her." His father leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "You think this is about love? Love won't pay your bills or protect your reputation. She'll drag you down, Alexander, and when she does, don't expect us to be there to pick you up." Alexander stood, his hands clenched into fists. "If that's how you feel, then maybe I don't need you to pick me up." That evening, Alexander made a decision. He packed a bag with a few essentials and left the estate, ignoring the protest of the staff as he walked out the door. He didn't know where he was going or what he would do, but he knew he couldn't stay. He found Lila at the shelter where she volunteered, helping distribute meals to those in need. When she saw him, her eyes widened in surprise. "Alexander," she said, setting down the tray she was carrying. "What are you doing here?" "I left," he said simply. She blinked, clearly taken aback. "What do you mean, you left?" "I mean, I walked away from it all," he said. "The money, this state, my family, none of it matters without you." Lila stared at him, her emotions warring on her face. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did," he said, taking her hands in his. "Because I love you, Lila. And I'm not going to let anyone, not even my family, tell me I can't." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't pull away this time. "You're crazy, you know that?" He smiled. "Maybe, but I don't care." For a moment, Lila didn't say anything. Her eyes searched his face, as if trying to understand the gravity of what he had just done. Walking away from a life of privilege wasn't something she could easily comprehend. "Alexander," she began, her voice breaking slightly, "you don't know what you're giving up." "I do," he said, his tone firm but gentle. "And none of it matters if it means losing you." She shook her head, still struggling to process his words. "But where will you go? What will you do? You've never lived outside of that world." Alexander smiled faintly, his confidence unwavering. "Then it's time I learn." Lila looked at him for a long moment before finally letting out a soft laugh. "You're stubborn, you know that?" "So I've been told," he replied, grinning. But you're not getting rid of me that easily. The days that followed were a whirlwind of adjustment for Alexander. He rented a modest apartment in a quiet part of the city, a far cry from the sprawling estate he had called home. The first few nights were strange, no staff to prepare his meals, no luxury furnishings, no endless conveniences. But there was a freedom in it, too. For the first time in his life, he felt untethered from expectations and free to make his own choices. Lila, meanwhile, was hesitant to let him too far into her world. While she admired his determination, she couldn't shake the fear that his family's influence would come crashing down on them at any moment. "You don't have to prove anything to me," she said one evening as they sat together in his small living room. "I already know you're different." "I'm not doing this to prove anything," Alexander replied. "I'm doing it because I want a life that feels real. And that life includes you." Lila smiled, though her worries lingered in the back of her mind. She had seen enough of the world to know that love alone wasn't always enough to overcome the obstacles they faced. Meanwhile, Alexander's family was far from idle. His father, enraged by his son's defiance, began pulling strings behind the scenes. He contacted business associates, spreading rumors about Alexander's mental state and insinuating that he was making reckless decisions. His mother, ever the socialite, ensured that whispers of Lila's unsuitability reached every corner of their elite circles. The pressure mounted as Alexander's name was quietly removed from family accounts and business ventures. Invitations to exclusive events dried up, and former friends distanced themselves, unwilling to risk their own reputations. Alexander, however, remained undeterred. He began working odd jobs to make ends meet, refusing to let his pride get in the way. For Lila, it was both inspiring and humbling to watch him adapt to a life he had never known. One afternoon, as they shared a simple lunch at a local cafe, Lila asked, "Do you miss it? The life you had before?" Alexander considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but only the parts that don't matter, comfort, convenience. None of that compares to this." "This?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. He smiled, reaching for her hand. "You?" But their newfound peace was short-lived. One evening, as they returned to Alexander's apartment, they found a man waiting outside, a lawyer dressed in a sharp suit, holding a briefcase. "Mr. Alexander," the man said, his tone formal. "I'm here on behalf of your father." Alexander's jaw tightened, but he nodded for the man to continue. "Your father has requested that you reconsider your decisions," the lawyer said. "He's prepared to restore your position within the family and the company, provided you agree to certain conditions." "And what are those conditions?" Alexander asked, though he already knew. The lawyer adjusted his glasses, his expression neutral. "You must sever all ties with Miss Lila and agree to a reconciliation with your family." Lila stiffened beside him, her face pale. Before Alexander could respond, she spoke up. "Tell him no," she said, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. "Tell him we don't want anything from him." The lawyer hesitated, clearly taken aback by her boldness. Alexander, however, smiled with quiet pride. "You heard her," he said. "We don't need anything from him. Now, if you'll excuse us." As they walked past the lawyer and into the apartment, Alexander felt a surge of determination. His family could throw every obstacle in their path, but he refused to let them win. The breaking point came a week later, when a tabloid published a scathing article about Lila. The headlines screamed accusations of gold digging and fabrications about her past. The story was filled with lies, clearly fed to the press by someone close to Alexander's family. Lila was devastated. She locked herself in the apartment, refusing to see anyone, even Alexander. "This is exactly what I was afraid of," she said through tears when he finally convinced her to talk. "I don't want to be the reason your life falls apart." "You're not," he said firmly, taking her hands in his. "You're the reason my life has meaning." "But look at what they're doing to you," she said. "To us." Alexander's expression hardened. "Then we'll fight back. Together." The next morning, Alexander wasted no time. He contacted a trusted journalist he had known from his former life, someone who valued integrity over sensationalism. He invited her to meet him at a small cafe, far from the prying eyes of his family's social circle. When she arrived, Alexander explained everything: the false rumors, the relentless attempts to discredit Lila, and the lengths his family had gone to maintain their control. The journalist listened intently, taking detailed notes. "This isn't just a story about family conflict," Alexander said. It's about power and the damage it causes when wielded without accountability. The journalist nodded. I'll write the truth, Alexander. But you have to be ready for the backlash. Your family won't take this lightly. I've been ready for a long time, he replied. Within days, the article was published. It painted a stark contrast between the cold, calculating tactics of Alexander's family and the genuine love and resilience he shared with Lila. The public response was overwhelming. Readers flooded the comment sections with messages of support, praising Alexander for standing up to his family and defending Lila. But the backlash from his family was swift. His father called him in a fury, his voice shaking with rage. How dare you air our private matters in public? Do you have any idea what you've done? I've told the truth, Alexander replied calmly. Something you should try for a change. This isn't over, his father warned. You'll regret this. Alexander hung up without another word, his resolve stronger than ever. Meanwhile, Lila found herself unexpectedly thrust into the spotlight. Strangers approached her on the street, offering words of encouragement and sharing their own stories of hardship and perseverance. For someone who had spent so long feeling invisible, it was both humbling and empowering. One afternoon, as she volunteered at the shelter, a young woman approached her with tears in her eyes. You don't know me, the woman said, but your story gave me hope. If you can stand up to people like that, maybe I can too. Lila smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. You're stronger than you think, she said. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But the fight was far from over. Alexander's family began using more underhanded tactics, including threatening the shelter where Lila volunteered. When she found out, she was furious. This is too much, Alexander, she said that evening. They're hurting people who have nothing to do with us. I know, he said, his expression grim. But we won't let them win. What can we do? She asked, her voice tinged with frustration. We outsmart them, he said. We use their own tactics against them. Over the next few weeks, Alexander and Lila worked together to gather evidence of his family's unethical practices. From exploiting workers in their businesses to manipulating the media, they uncovered a web of corruption that stretched far beyond their personal vendetta. With the help of the journalist and a growing network of allies, they compiled a detailed expose. The report not only exposed the family's misdeeds, but also highlighted the resilience and courage of those who had been wronged by their actions. When the expose went public, it sent shockwaves through the community. Investors withdrew their support, partnerships crumbled, and the family's pristine reputation was irreparably damaged. In the aftermath, Alexander and Lila found themselves standing at a crossroads. They had won the battle, but their lives would never be the same. I never wanted to destroy your family, Lila said one evening as they sat on the balcony of their apartment. I just wanted to be with you. And now we can be, Alexander said, taking her hand, without anyone standing in our way. Their journey wasn't without challenges, but it was worth every struggle. Alexander started his own business, one built on ethical practices and a commitment to giving back to the community. Lila, inspired by the support she had received, opened a small nonprofit organization to help others rebuild their lives. As they built their new lives together, they never forgot where they came from or the lessons they had learned. Their love, tested by fire, emerged stronger than ever. As the expose rippled through the media, Alexander's family retreated into silence, the weight of their actions crashing down on them. Socialites who had once flocked to their parties now avoided them, and the family's business empire began to show cracks. But Alexander and Lila knew this wasn't the end. While the initial wave of public backlash was satisfying, there was still much work to be done to reclaim their lives from the chaos his family had caused. One evening, as they sat at the kitchen table poring over documents for Alexander's new venture, Lila paused, her brow furrowed. Are you sure about this? She asked, glancing up at him. Starting a business is a huge risk, especially with everything going on. Alexander reached for her hand, his eyes steady. It's a risk worth taking. I want to build something real, something that aligns with the values you've taught me. Lila's lips curved into a small smile, though her worry lingered. I just don't want you to feel like you have to prove anything, to me or anyone else. I'm not trying to prove anything, he said. I'm trying to live the life I should have been living all along. Meanwhile, the backlash against Alexander's family continued to grow. Former employees and business partners began coming forward with their own stories of mistreatment and corruption. The once powerful family found themselves fighting to maintain even a shred of credibility. But Alexander's father, wasn't one to give up without a fight. Late one night, Alexander received a knock on his apartment door. When he opened it, he was surprised to find his father standing there, his face lined with a mix of anger and desperation. "May I come in?" his father asked, his tone clipped. Alexander hesitated before stepping aside. "What do you want?" His father entered, looking around the modest apartment with barely concealed disdain. "We need to talk," he said. "About this mess you've created." "This mess I've created?" Alexander repeated, crossing his arms. "You mean the truth I exposed?" His father ignored the jab, instead focusing on the papers strewn across the table. "I see you're trying to start your own business. Do you have any idea how difficult that's going to be without our support?" "I'll manage," Alexander replied, his tone icy. "I'd rather struggle on my own than rely on the kind of support you offer." His father's jaw tightened. "You're being naive. This woman has turned you against your own family. Do you really think she cares about you? Or is she just after what's left of your name?" Alexander's temper flared, but he kept his voice steady. "Lila has shown me more kindness and loyalty than you ever have. She's not the problem, you are." For a moment, his father seemed taken aback by his son's conviction. But the moment passed, and his expression hardened once more. "You're making a mistake, Alexander. And when this all falls apart, don't come crawling back." Alexander met his father's gaze, unflinching. "I won't." The encounter left Alexander shaken, but it only strengthened his resolve. He threw himself into building his business, pouring every ounce of his energy into creating something that reflected his new values. Lila, too, found herself at a crossroads. The support she had received from strangers in the wake of the exposé inspired her to do more. She began organizing community workshops, teaching others the skills she had learned during her time on the streets. One evening, as they sat together reviewing plans for their respective projects, Alexander looked over at Lila and smiled. "You know," he said, "I think you found your calling." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'm just trying to make a difference." "You already have," he said, his voice warm. "Not just for me, but for so many others." But as their lives slowly began to stabilize, new challenges emerged. Alexander's family, unwilling to accept defeat, started planting rumors about his business practices, hoping to sabotage his reputation before he could fully establish himself. The strain began to take its toll. Alexander and Lila found themselves working longer hours, juggling the demands of their projects while fending off the constant attacks. There were nights when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them, but they refused to give up. "We've come this far," Lila said one night as they sat on the couch, leaning on each other for support. "We can't let them win." "We won't," Alexander said, his voice firm. "They may have money and power, but we have something they don't." "And what's that?" Lila asked, a tired smile playing on her lips. "Integrity," he said, "and each other." The attacks from Alexander's family only seemed to grow more sophisticated. Anonymous complaints were filed against his fledgling business, delaying permits and casting doubt among potential investors. Lila's workshops, too, began to face sudden disruptions, venues canceling bookings at the last minute, supplies mysteriously going missing. It was clear that someone was pulling strings to make their lives as difficult as possible. Despite the obstacles, Alexander and Lila refused to back down. If anything, the challenges only strengthened their determination. They leaned on each other during the toughest moments, finding solace in their shared purpose. One evening, as they worked late into the night in their tiny apartment, Alexander paused, his pen hovering over a notebook. "Do you ever think about what life would be like if we just gave up?" Lila looked up from her laptop, her brows furrowing. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, running a hand through his hair, "if we stopped fighting. If we just disappeared and started over somewhere else." Lila considered his words for a moment before shaking her head. "I've thought about it," she admitted. "But that's not who we are. Running away wouldn't change anything. It would just let them win." He nodded slowly, her words sinking in. "You're right. But some days, it feels like we're fighting an impossible battle." "Maybe we are," she said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "But impossible battles are the ones worth fighting." Their resilience began to pay off in unexpected ways. Word of Alexander's struggles against his powerful family spread, drawing the attention of others who admired his courage. Small business owners, community leaders, and even former employees of his family's company reached out, offering their support. One such supporter was a retired entrepreneur named Margaret. who had once been a close friend of Alexander's mother. Margaret had distanced herself from the family years ago, disillusioned by their ruthless behavior. When she learned of Alexander's efforts, she decided to help. "I've been waiting for someone to stand up to them," Margaret said during their first meeting. "Your father may have power, but he's built his empire on fear and manipulation. It's about time someone showed him what true leadership looks like." Her guidance proved invaluable. With Margaret's connections and mentorship, Alexander's business began to gain traction. Investors who had been hesitant to back him started to come around, impressed by his vision and determination. Lila, too, found unexpected allies. A local community organization reached out, offering to partner with her workshops and provide additional resources. Together, they launched a series of initiatives aimed at empowering underprivileged individuals, giving them the tools to build better futures. But not everyone was happy with their progress. Alexander's father, watching from the sidelines as his son's influence grew, decided to escalate his efforts. He arranged for a smear campaign in the media, painting Alexander as ungrateful and reckless and accusing Lila of manipulating him for her own gain. The articles were harsh, filled with half-truths and outright lies. But instead of breaking their spirits, the attacks only fueled their resolve. "We knew this would happen," Lila said as they read through the latest headlines together. "They're running out of ways to stop us, so they're resorting to desperation." Alexander nodded, his jaw tightening. "Let them. Every lie they tell only makes the truth more powerful." To counter the campaign, they decided to go public with their story. With the help of Margaret and a trusted journalist, they arranged for an in-depth interview that laid everything bare: their journey, their struggles, and their unwavering commitment to each other and their values. The interview aired on a primetime news segment, capturing the attention of viewers across the country. Lila spoke candidly about her experiences, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Alexander, too, opened up in a way he never had before, sharing his regrets about the life he had once lived and his hopes for the future. The response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from people who had faced similar challenges, as well as those who were inspired by their courage. Donations flooded into Lila's workshops, allowing her to expand her programs and reach even more people in need. Alexander's business, too, saw a surge of interest. Customers and clients were drawn to his authenticity and commitment to ethical practices, eager to support someone who had dared to defy the odds. But even as their lives began to stabilize, Alexander and Lila knew the fight wasn't over. His family still wielded significant influence, and there were bound to be more challenges ahead. Yet for the first time, they felt truly prepared to face whatever came next. Despite the overwhelming support they had received, the challenges were far from over. Alexander's father, furious at the public sympathy his son and Lila had garnered, began leveraging his political connections to create legal roadblocks for both of them. Permits for Alexander's business were delayed without explanation, while inspections for Lila's community workshops seemed to occur weekly, each more invasive than the last. One evening, as Alexander returned to their apartment after another grueling day, he found Lila sitting at the table, her head resting on her hands. Papers were scattered around her, most of them notices from the city about compliance issues. "They're not going to stop, are they?" she asked quietly, her voice heavy with exhaustion. Alexander sighed, dropping his bag by the door. "No," he admitted, sitting down beside her. "But that doesn't mean we stop either." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face for reassurance. "What if they find a way to shut everything down?" "They won't," he said firmly. "We've come too far to let them win now." Lila nodded, though her worry didn't fade. "It's just, I never wanted this to be a fight. I just wanted us to have a chance." "And we will," Alexander said, reaching for her hand. "But chances like this don't come without a cost. We just have to keep going." In the weeks that followed, Alexander and Lila worked tirelessly to counter every obstacle thrown their way. They enlisted the help of lawyers, community leaders, and even volunteers from Lila's workshops to navigate the endless stream of legal challenges. The constant battle took its toll on them both, but they refused to give up. One morning, Alexander received a call from Margaret, who had been quietly monitoring the situation. "I've been doing some digging," she said. "Your father's been pulling strings, but I found something you might be able to use against him." "What is it?" Alexander asked, his curiosity piqued. "It's a series of questionable deals his company made years ago." Margaret explained. Deals that, if exposed, could seriously damage his credibility. Alexander frowned. "Are you sure about this? I don't want to stoop to his level." It's not about stooping to his level, Margaret said. It's about holding him accountable. If you don't use this, he'll just keep coming after you. Alexander hesitated, torn between his desire for justice and his reluctance to escalate the conflict further. But as he looked around the apartment, the stacks of legal documents, the weary expression on Lila's face, he realized they didn't have a choice. "Send me what you have," he said finally. "Let's put an end to this." The information Margaret provided was damning. It detailed years of unethical practices, from exploiting workers to evading taxes, all carefully hidden behind layers of corporate bureaucracy. Alexander and Lila knew that exposing the truth would have far-reaching consequences, but they also knew it was the only way to level the playing field. They worked late into the night, compiling the evidence into a comprehensive report. With Margaret's help, they shared it with a trusted investigative journalist who had a reputation for taking down corrupt power players. The exposé hit the news a week later, and the fallout was immediate. Alexander's father was forced to step down as CEO of his company amid mounting public outrage. The family's once unshakable influence began to crumble, their reputation irreparably damaged. But the victory came with its own challenges. While Alexander and Lila had succeeded in exposing the corruption, the relentless battle had left them both drained. Their newfound freedom came at a cost, and they found themselves questioning what their next steps should be. As the dust began to settle, Alexander and Lila took a rare evening off to reflect on everything they had been through. They sat together on a balcony of their apartment, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. "It feels strange," Lila said, her voice quiet, "not having to fight anymore." Alexander nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It does. But maybe now we can focus on building something instead of just surviving." She smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "That sounds nice." For the first time in months, they allowed themselves a moment of peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like it was truly theirs to navigate. As the revelations about Alexander's father rippled through the media, the family faced an unprecedented storm. Former allies distanced themselves, and the board of directors scrambled to salvage what was left of their reputation. Alexander's father, once a towering figure of influence, was now fighting to keep his empire intact. But the pressure from his family didn't completely ease. Even though his father's public power was waning, some members of Alexander's extended family, uncles, cousins, and others with stakes in the family's wealth, were enraged by what they perceived as a betrayal. Alexander received an unexpected email from his cousin Edgar, someone he hadn't spoken to in years. Edgar, who had always towed the family line, requested a meeting at a neutral location. Against his better judgment, Alexander agreed. They met at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. Edgar arrived looking tense, his tailored suit contrasting sharply with the casual patrons around him. "Alexander," Edgar said, taking a seat. "I didn't think you'd actually come." "Well, you reached out," Alexander replied, leaning back in his chair. "What do you want?" Edgar hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure they weren't being overheard. "Look, I'll be honest. You've stirred up a lot of trouble. The family is furious, and they're not going to let this go." "I figured as much," Alexander said, his tone calm but firm. "What else is new?" Edgar leaned forward, lowering his voice. "They're planning to take legal action against you. Something about breach of confidentiality and defamation. They want to make an example out of you." Alexander felt a surge of anger, but kept his composure. "So that's why you're here? To warn me?" "Partly," Edgar admitted, "but also to offer you a way out." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "And what would that be?" Edgar hesitated before answering. "If you issue a public apology and agree to step away from all of this, they'll drop the charges. You could avoid a long, messy court battle." Alexander let out a bitter laugh. "And go back to pretending everything is fine? No, thanks." "Alexander, be reasonable," Edgar said, his tone urgent. "You've already caused enough damage. Just walk away while you still can." "I'm not the one who caused the damage," Alexander replied, standing up. "And I'm not walking away." As Edgar's warning hung in the air, Alexander returned to the apartment to find Lila going through a stack of letters. She looked up as he walked in, sensing the tension in his posture. "What happened?" she asked, setting the letters aside. "Edgar," he said, sinking into the chair beside her. "He came to warn me that the family is planning to sue." Lila's expression darkened. "Of course they are. They'll do anything to shut you down." Alexander nodded, his jaw tightening. He offered me a way out, a chance to apologize and step away. And she asked, though she already knew his answer. I told him no, Alexander said. I'm not giving them the satisfaction. Lila reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. We'll figure this out. Whatever they throw at us, we'll face it together. Her words were a balm to his frayed nerves, and for a moment, the weight of everything felt a little lighter. Over the next few weeks, Alexander and Lila prepared for the legal battle that loomed on the horizon. They enlisted the help of a lawyer recommended by Margaret, someone who specialized in taking on powerful adversaries. The process was daunting, but they refused to let fear dictate their actions. Meanwhile, the community continued to rally around them. Donations poured into Lila's workshops, allowing her to expand her programs even further. Alexander's business, though still in its early stages, began to attract attention for its ethical practices and innovative approach. One evening, as they reviewed documents in the living room, Lila paused, a thoughtful look on her face. What if we turn this into an opportunity? She asked. Alexander looked up from his laptop. What do you mean? I mean, instead of just defending ourselves, what if we use this as a platform to push for change? She said. We've already exposed the corruption in your family's business. Why not take it a step further? Alexander considered her words, the spark of determination igniting in his chest. You're right. If they want to fight, we'll give them one on our terms. Their decision marked a turning point. With the help of their lawyer, they began gathering more evidence of unethical practices within the family's business empire. They reached out to former employees, suppliers, and even competitors who had been wronged by the family's tactics. The effort wasn't without risks. They faced constant surveillance, anonymous threats, and attempts to discredit their credibility. But with each new piece of evidence, their case grew stronger. One day, Margaret called with news that left them stunned. I found something, she said, her voice urgent. Something that could change everything. What is it? Alexander asked, his heart pounding. It's a series of financial records, Margaret explained. They show illegal offshore accounts and money laundering. If this gets out, it won't just be a scandal. It could lead to criminal charges. The revelation Margaret uncovered was the most damning yet. The financial records not only exposed illegal offshore accounts, but also tied Alexander's father and several high-ranking executives to fraudulent activities that spanned years. It was a bombshell that could dismantle the remnants of his family's influence. As Alexander and Lila reviewed the documents, the weight of their decision pressed heavily on them. This wasn't just about standing up to a powerful family. It was about exposing a system of corruption that had harmed countless people. This is it, Alexander said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. If we release this, there's no going back. Lila reached for his hand, her grip firm. Then let's do it. They've taken enough from us and from everyone else. With the help of their lawyer and Margaret, they prepared the evidence for release. The exposé was published on a leading investigative journalism platform, accompanied by a detailed report that left no room for denial. The fallout was immediate and far-reaching. Authorities launched investigations, freezing the family's assets and issuing subpoenas for key figures involved. Media outlets scrambled to cover the story, and public outrage reached a fever pitch. For Alexander's father, the consequences were devastating. Once a pillar of high society, he now faced criminal charges that threatened to strip him of his freedom and legacy. His former allies abandoned him, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Alexander's extended family, who had once rallied against him, fell silent. Without their patriarch's influence to shield them, they too faced scrutiny and the potential collapse of their fortunes. But for Alexander and Lila, the victory was bittersweet. They had achieved what many thought was impossible, taking down a powerful dynasty, but the journey had taken its toll. Months of stress, sacrifice, and relentless attacks had left them both physically and emotionally exhausted. One evening, as they stood on the balcony of their apartment, watching the city lights flicker in the distance, Alexander turned to Lila, his expression soft. We did it, he said quietly. It's finally over. She smiled, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. It doesn't feel real. It will, he said, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. And now we can start again. On our terms. Their new beginning wasn't without challenges, but it was filled with purpose. Alexander's business flourished, gaining recognition for its ethical practices and community impact. Lila's workshops expanded into a full-fledged nonprofit organization, providing resources and support to hundreds of people in need. Together, They built a life rooted in the values they had fought so hard to uphold: kindness, integrity, and resilience. Years later, as they walked through a bustling park hand in hand, they paused to watch a group of children playing by a fountain. A woman approached them, smiling warmly. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Alexander and Lila?" They exchanged a glance before nodding. "Yes," Alexander said. "I just wanted to thank you," the woman said, her voice filled with emotion. "Your story inspired me to leave a toxic situation and start over. I don't think I'd be here today if it weren't for you." Lila smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You're stronger than you think," she said. "Never forget that." As the woman walked away, Alexander turned to Lila, his smile tinged with awe. "You realize we've come full circle, right? We were once the ones needing help. Now we're the ones giving it." She nodded, her gaze steady. "And that's the life I've always wanted." With the sun setting behind them, they continued their walk, their hearts full and their future brighter than ever.